Welcome to Deep Fear, Dark Tales, where dark stories come to life. Prepare to step into a world of mystery and terror, where ancient legends awaken and creatures that should remain in the shadows are revealed. Today, you will hear the story of a group of friends who decide to explore the depths of an isolated forest in Virginia, unaware of the dangers that await. They only wanted a weekend of adventure, but what they found was something much older and far more terrifying. With every step they took, the forest became more oppressive, darker, until disturbing signs began to appear. Giant footprints, shadows between the trees, and a constant feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Will they be able to escape the darkness? Or are they destined to become part of the legend that has haunted these lands for centuries? Remember, in places like this, there are things better left undiscovered. The sun was already beginning to set when Jake turned off the car in front of the cabin. The wooden structure, surrounded by tall, dense trees, looked small and cozy, the perfect place for the group of friends to escape the routine. The sound of the engine stopping was immediately replaced by the distant singing of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lily was the first to get out, stretching her arms as she breathed in the fresh forest air. "Finally, peace and quiet," she said, smiling at Jake, who was still checking the map on his phone. Tom and Sarah followed shortly after, excited about the idea of a weekend away from the city. The cabin was modest, but equipped with the essentials. There was no cell signal, which Tom considered an advantage, since he planned to fully disconnect. They brought supplies and drinks, ready for a relaxing weekend exploring nature. "Have you heard the story of the local legend?" Tom asked as they unloaded the bags. "There you go with your conspiracy theories, Tom," Sarah said, rolling her eyes with a smile. "We just got here, don't start with that stuff." "I'm serious," Tom insisted, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "The cabin owner told me this forest is haunted by an ancient creature. He even said to avoid certain areas." Lily gave a nervous laugh, but Jake just shook his head. "Small-town superstition," Jake said dismissively. "They probably say that to keep tourists away from the dangerous parts of the forest. Tomorrow, we'll explore without fear. No monsters around here." Even so, there was something in the air that unsettled Lily. The silence of the forest was strange, almost oppressive. There wasn't the usual sound of insects or small animals, just an uncomfortable void. As the group settled in, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though she didn't mention it to anyone. As night fell, the cabin seemed to be the only point of light in the growing darkness of the forest. They gathered around a small campfire outside, talking about their lives and laughing at the stories Tom kept telling about legends and mysteries. However, when he mentioned the stories of mysterious disappearances in the area, the laughter faded, and the group retreated inside the cabin, where the environment felt safer and more controlled. As they settled in for the night, a strong wind blew outside, making the trees creak almost eerily. Jake tried to sleep, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Tom's words. It was just superstition, right? Dawn brought temporary relief to the group, but the forest around them seemed denser and quieter than the previous night. Tom was the first to wake up and stepped outside to walk around the cabin. Something was bothering him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When he reached the back of the house, he stopped abruptly. "Jake, come here!" he shouted, trying not to sound alarmed, but with a tone that made his friend run over to him. Around the cabin, on the damp, leaf-covered ground, were footprints, large, wider, and deeper than anything they had ever seen. They were so big, they seemed to belong to a massive creature. "What the hell is this?" Jake asked, crouching down to examine the marks. "Some big animal," Tom replied, looking around. "But strange. I've never seen anything like it." The footprints led to the edge of the forest and disappeared abruptly, as if the creature had melted into the shadows of the trees. When Lily and Sarah joined them, concern began to grow. Could it have been just a bear? Sarah suggested, without much conviction. We don't know much about the wildlife here. If it's a bear, it's the biggest bear I've ever seen, Jake responded, forcing a laugh to lighten the tension. Anyway, we should stay alert, even trying to remain calm. Jake glanced at the trees around them, as if expecting something. He felt watched, though he couldn't see anyone. They decided to continue with their plans for the day, hiking through the forest to a stream about an hour away. As they walked, the silence of the forest became unnerving. There was no sound of birds or animals, just the soft rustling of leaves underfoot. Every now and then, a snap of a broken branch echoed among the trees, making the group stop, nervous, searching for the source of the sounds. Lily, usually the most connected to nature, couldn't focus. She felt uncomfortable, as if the forest itself was trying to push them away. Her gaze was constantly drawn to the depths of the trees, where shadows moved too quickly to identify. She tried to shake off the feeling, but inside, panic was starting to rise. When they reached the stream, Tom was the first to break the heavy silence that had settled among them. "Okay, this is getting weird even for me," he said, splashing his face with the cold stream water. "I know I talked about the legends, but maybe we should head back." Jake gave a nervous laugh, but seemed more hesitant than confident. "Maybe you're right, man," he replied, glancing around. "Something about this forest is making me uneasy." Before they could decide what to do, Lily let out a muffled gasp. She was standing next to a tree, staring intently at a symbol carved into the trunk. It was a strange design, like a circle with crossed lines, resembling an ancient symbol none of them recognized. "Who would do this out here in the middle of nowhere?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "Maybe locals," Jake suggested. "It could just be a hunter's mark, or..." "It's not normal," Lily cut in. "This is a warning. I feel like we shouldn't be here." The group decided to head back to the cabin immediately. The way back, which had seemed clear before, now felt longer and more labyrinthine. The shadows between the trees grew longer, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every step. When they finally reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the discomfort had consumed them. Everyone was tense and silent, trying to rationalize what had happened. The environment, which once felt welcoming, now felt oppressive. Night was approaching again, and with it, the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. Before they entered the cabin, Sarah took one last look at the forest. There was something out there. She could feel it. A quick movement between the trees. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving her unsure if she had really seen anything. They locked themselves inside the cabin that night, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest outside was too quiet. No one wanted to be the first to speak about what they had seen, but they all knew something was waiting for them out there. As the wind howled through the trees, Lily whispered to herself, "They're watching us." The third night arrived, bringing an even denser darkness over the forest. The wind stirred the trees with more intensity, and the silence, interrupted only by occasional snapping branches in the distance, seemed increasingly sinister. Inside the cabin, the group was restless. None of them could ignore the growing sense of danger that hung in the air. "We should leave tomorrow," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here. These sounds and those footprints, it's not normal." Jake, who had been trying to stay calm since the beginning, didn't respond immediately. He knew Sarah was right, but he didn't want to admit that he was starting to feel the same fear as the others. "I agree," Tom said, his carefree attitude long gone. I don't like what's happening. The footprints, that symbol. This isn't a joke. Lily, however, was strangely silent. Ever since she had seen the symbol carved into the tree, she seemed more distant, as if absorbed in her own thoughts. She stared out the window, watching the thick darkness surrounding the cabin, her eyes lost in the tree line. "Lily," Jake called, approaching her. "Are you okay?" Lily turned slowly, her face pale in the dim light of the lamp. She hesitated before answering, as if carefully choosing her words. "I feel like there's something out there. Something big and very old." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "We're not alone here. They're watching, waiting." Jake frowned, concerned about his girlfriend's state. He knew Lily had always been more connected to nature, more sensitive to her surroundings, but this change in her behavior was alarming. "They?" Tom asked, trying to understand what she meant. Before Lily could answer, a loud noise echoed from outside, interrupting the conversation. It was a heavy sound, as if something massive had moved among the trees. The group froze, their hearts racing in their chests. Jake grabbed a flashlight and hesitated at the door. "Don't do it," Sarah pleaded, her voice high and trembling. "Don't go out there." "I'll just take a quick look," Jake replied, trying to sound confident, but his hand shook slightly as he opened the door. Outside, the darkness was thick, almost tangible. He turned on the flashlight, illuminating the area around the cabin. Nothing moved, except the trees swaying in the wind. But then, across the small clearing, he saw something. Two bright points, like eyes reflecting the flashlight, watching from afar. Before he could react, the eyes vanished into the shadows. "What did you see?" Tom asked, seeing the disturbed expression on Jake's face. I think I saw something," Jake said, quickly locking the door. "Maybe it's best if we don't go outside again until morning." The group agreed to try and sleep, despite the evident fear filling the room. However, a few hours later, something even more unsettling happened. When everyone was already in bed, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin echoed again. But this time, they seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, Lily, who had been lying next to Jake, got up abruptly and walked toward the door. "Lily, where are you going?" Jake asked, alarmed, but she didn't respond. As if in a trance, Lily opened the door and stepped into the darkness, her movements slow and mechanical. Jake and Tom ran after her, calling her name, but the darkness swallowed her before they could reach her. Panic set in. "Lily, come back," Jake shouted, running barefoot over the uneven ground. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the night, but Lily had already disappeared among the trees. Tom and Sarah, unsure of what to do, followed Jake as far as they could, their flashlights barely lighting the path. After minutes of frantic searching, they heard a muffled scream from far away, like the last breath of someone before disappearing into the darkness. "She's over there," Jake yelled, following the sound. But when they reached the spot where the scream had come from, all they found was an eerie silence and an oppressive feeling that they weren't alone. It was Sarah who found Lily lying beside a tree, her eyes wide but vacant. She was alive, but unconscious, with strange marks on her arm, like deep scratches, forming a pattern that none of them could identify. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, trembling, as Tom examined the wounds. "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice shaky. "But whatever it is, it's very close to us." With difficulty, they carried Lily back to the cabin, laying her on the bed, still unconscious. Fear was now etched on everyone's faces. Something was hunting them, something that seemed to know their steps better than they did. As the others tried to process what had just happened, Lily muttered something, still unconscious. Her words were almost inaudible, but what they managed to hear made their blood run cold, eyes red watching. The next morning brought little light to the inside of the cabin. The forest, once inviting, now seemed to be closing in around them. Lily was still unconscious, her breathing heavy, as Sarah watched her with concern. Jake and Tom sat at the table, trying to decide what to do. The fear in the air was palpable, as if something invisible was oppressing the atmosphere. "We can't stay here," Tom said, breaking the silence. "Whatever attacked Lily is out there, and it's closing in on us." Jake agreed, though reluctantly. He blamed himself for not taking the signs seriously from the start. Now his girlfriend was hurt, and they were trapped in a cabin in the middle of a forest that seemed to have a life of its own. "We need to leave now," Jake said, standing decisively. "Let's grab Lily and get out of this cursed place. Maybe we'll find a signal closer to the road. What if whatever it is finds us on the way?" Sarah asked, her voice full of hesitation. "We don't have a choice," Jake replied, forcing a tone of courage he clearly didn't feel. "Staying here is worse. That thing found us here. We're not safe." As Tom and Jake gathered their things, the forest around the cabin seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was approaching its peak. Sarah tried to wake Lily, but the girl remained unconscious, muttering incoherent words about red eyes and shadows. "We'll have to carry her," Tom said, observing Lily's condition. "We don't have time to wait for her to wake up." Determined, they left the cabin with Lily in their arms, heading back down the path that would take them to the main road. But they quickly realized that the once familiar path now seemed different. The forest had changed. The trails seemed to shift, confusing them, and the sounds around them grew more distant, as if something was erasing any trace of direction. After hours of walking without a clear destination, Jake stopped, panting, and gently laid Lily on the ground. Exhaustion was taking over, but something far more terrifying was happening. The path wasn't leading anywhere. They had been walking in circles. "This can't be," Jake said, rubbing his face with his hands, frustration building. "This was the right way. I'm sure of it." Tom, equally exhausted, looked at the horizon, but all he could see were endless trees, as if the forest was a living labyrinth. The silence was total, except for the sound of their heavy breathing. "We're trapped here," Tom said quietly, as if finally grasping the gravity of the situation. At that moment, a deep, distant sound echoed through the trees. It was a roar, low and resonant, that made everyone stop and look around with wide eyes. That sound wasn't from any ordinary animal. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking with fear. "I think we're about to find out," Tom replied, picking up a rock from the ground, as if it were the only defense he had against whatever was coming. Then the monster appeared. It emerged from the trees, its gigantic, misshapen form stepping out of the darkness like a nightmare come to life. It was at least 2 meters tall, its dark, scaly skin gleaming in the filtered light through the trees. Its red eyes, exactly as Lily had described, glowed like embers, focused directly on the group. Its long, sharp claws scratched at the trees around it, emitting a metallic sound that made their hair stand on end. Jake tried to move quickly to pick up Lily, but the monster charged, its heavy legs crushing the ground beneath its feet. The creature's roar made the forest seem to vibrate, as if the very earth was alive. "Run!" Tom shouted, pushing Sarah away as he tried to distract the creature. Jake grabbed Lily in his arms once more, and the group ran as fast as they could, trying to escape the creature that pursued them. The monster was fast, moving with terrifying agility for its size. Its furious screams echoed, making it impossible not to feel terror consuming their minds. They stumbled, fought to keep going, while the sound of the creature's claws tearing through the air followed close behind. With each step, the fear grew. The forest seemed to conspire against them, with low branches and roots rising from the ground to try to block their path. The monster was closing in, its oppressive presence pushing them toward a breaking point. Suddenly, Tom stopped abruptly and looked ahead. There, amidst the trees, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A cave hidden among the rocks. Without thinking, he shouted, "There, let's hide in there." Jake and Sarah followed Tom, running toward the dark opening. As they entered the cave, darkness enveloped them, and the sound of the enraged creature outside made them crouch down, holding their breath. For long minutes, all they heard was the sound of the monster's claws scratching at the rocks outside. It seemed to be trying to figure out where they were. The group barely breathed, fearing that any sound would give away their position. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held Lily, who was still unconscious. Jake, feeling powerless, looked around the cave. There were inscriptions on the walls, ancient markings like the ones they had found on the tree before. Strange symbols that seemed to tell a story he still couldn't understand. Then he realized they were hiding in the monster's lair. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice trembling. "We're in its den." But before they could think of a plan, the monster roared again from outside, its fury growing. The group was trapped, and the feeling that there was no escape took hold of them. Time was running out, and the battle for survival was just beginning. The silence in the cave was as oppressive as the darkness around them. The monster outside was still prowling, its low, menacing growls echoing off the rocks. Each of them could barely breathe, their senses dominated by fear as they tried to think of a way to escape alive. Jake, with his eyes fixed on the inscriptions on the cave wall, realized they weren't just in any place. "This," he began, his voice low but urgent. "These symbols, they're the same ones we saw on the tree yesterday." Tom, who had been crouching near the entrance, trying to listen for the monster's movements, quickly turned. "What does that mean?" he asked, still panting from the chase. "Are we in this thing's lair? Is that a good sign, or does it mean we're dead?" Jake moved closer to the cave walls, running his hand over the symbols carved into the rock. They seemed ancient, very old. The drawings weren't just marks. They told a story. Small human figures bowed before a giant creature with flaming eyes. Sacrifices were offered, and the creature appeared to accept them, leaving the figures in peace. "I think we're dealing with something much older than we imagined. This isn't just a monster. It's a kind of guardian, something that has protected this forest for centuries," Jake said, feeling the weight of the truth unfolding in his words. "A guardian?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "A guardian of what?" "Of the forest, of the land. These symbols show people offering something, a sacrifice. They believe that by doing this, they would be safe, that the creature would leave them alone." Jake paused, his eyes fixed on a part of the cave where there seemed to be a stain of old blood. "Maybe that's what it wants from us." The tension in the cave thickened. The idea of a sacrifice loomed over them like a heavy, inevitable shadow. Tom shook his head, disbelieving. "It can't be," he said, though doubt was already evident in his voice. "We can't give in to superstition. That won't solve anything." Outside, the monster let out another roar, this time closer to the cave entrance. Jake knew time was running out. He didn't want to believe that a sacrifice would be the only way out, but the markings on the walls and the history passed down through generations of locals indicated that this being wasn't a mere beast. It was something beyond the natural, something that followed ancient rules. "We need a plan," Jake said, his mind racing with possibilities. "We can't just wait for it to find us here. But if these symbols tell the truth, then maybe there's a way to appease this thing." Sarah, desperate, looked at Lily, still unconscious, murmuring incoherent words. She knew they couldn't keep running forever. "What are we going to do, Jake?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "We can't fight that thing." "Maybe we don't have to fight," he replied, trying to stay calm. "Maybe it's a matter of understanding what it wants and finding a way to get out of here alive." The sound of the monster's claws scraping against the rock was like a ticking clock, each scratch reminding them that time was running out. Jake knew the decisive moment was approaching. They had to act fast, or their fate would be sealed in blood. "There's no other choice," he whispered, almost as if talking to himself. "If these markings are true, we have to follow what they say." Tom remained silent, his eyes staring into the darkness beyond the cave. He, too, was starting to accept what Jake was saying, no matter how absurd it seemed. If there really was a ritual, a sacrifice, something that could appease the monster, they would have to take the risk. The only question was, who would make the sacrifice? The sound of the monster's claws scraping against the rocks outside the cave made everyone's hearts pound faster. Time was running out, and the thought of making a sacrifice to appease the creature hung over the group like a death sentence. Jake, Tom, Sarah, and the unconscious Lily were now trapped between terror and the hardest decision they'd ever faced. "So, how do we do this?" Tom asked, his voice low and hesitant. He couldn't believe they were actually considering the idea, but desperation had driven them to a point of no return. Jake wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. Every fiber of his being resisted the idea of sacrificing someone, but he knew they had no options left. The markings on the walls told a clear story, and the monster outside was waiting for something or someone. "I don't know," Jake whispered, "but if those old legends are true, the monster will only stop if it gets a sacrifice. I don't know if it'll work, but what else can we do?" Sarah, still holding Lily's hand, shook her head in denial. Her eyes were filled with tears, and her body trembled with fear and exhaustion. "We can't sacrifice anyone," Sarah cried, her voice broken by despair. "There's no guarantee this will work, and even if it does, we can't just do that." The silence that followed was suffocating. They knew she was right, but at the same time, the thought of facing the monster head-on, without a plan or hope of survival, felt like a certain death sentence. Tom moved closer to the cave entrance, watching the massive shadow moving between the trees. The monster was still there, circling like a predator, knowing its prey had nowhere to go. He looked back at Jake and shook his head, resigned. "We can't just sit here waiting. If we don't do something, it's going to come in and take us anyway." Jake felt his chest tighten. He looked at Lily, still unconscious, and then at Sarah, whose silent tears streamed down her cheeks. A terrible idea crept into his mind, something he didn't dare say aloud, but knew he was thinking. I'll sacrifice myself," Jake finally said, his voice trembling but determined. "If that's what it wants, if it's the only way for you to get out alive, I'll do it." Sarah stared at him in shock, clutching Lily's hands tighter. "No, Jake, you can't. We can't let you do this." "I'm not asking for permission," Jake replied, more firmly now. "If this is what's going to stop that thing from killing all of us, then it's what needs to be done. You need to survive. Someone has to get out of here and tell the world what happened." Tom, silently watching, saw the resolve in Jake's eyes. He knew his friend wouldn't back down, and the reality of the situation began to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "If you do this," Tom said, his voice thick with sadness. "I'll take care of Sarah and Lily. I'll make sure we get out of here and tell the truth." Jake nodded, knowing his decision was already made. He moved closer to Sarah, who was quietly sobbing, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry about me," he said, trying to sound more confident than he really felt. "It's going to be okay." He didn't believe it, but it was what Sarah needed to hear. Jake stepped slowly out of the cave without looking back. The cold of the forest wrapped around his body as he walked into the clearing where the monster was waiting for him. His feet sank into the damp earth, and the sound of the creature's breathing grew louder with every step he took toward his fate. There it was, the colossal creature with red eyes, standing like a living shadow among the trees. The monster's gaze locked with Jake's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Jake felt fear grip his body, but he fought to stay steady. "I'm here," Jake shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. "Is this what you want?" "I'm here." The monster growled, moving closer, its claws tearing into the ground and trees around it. Each step it took made the earth tremble, and Jake felt the desperation building inside him. But he didn't flinch. He knew this was his only chance to save the others. When the monster was only a few meters away from Jake, it raised one of its giant claws, ready to deliver the fatal blow. Jake closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But then a loud, piercing sound echoed through the forest. Suddenly, Tom came running, holding an improvised torch he had lit inside the cave. He shouted, waving the torch at the monster. "Hey, hey," Tom yelled, trying to divert the creature's attention. "If you want to sacrifice, come get me." The monster, startled by the sudden intervention, turned its attention toward Tom, leaving Jake to fall to his knees, stunned by the turn of events. Tom kept running, trying to keep the monster occupied, while Sarah and Lily appeared at the cave entrance. "Tom, what are you doing?" Sarah screamed, desperate. "Trying to save our friends," he shouted back, breathless. "If someone has to sacrifice themselves, it might as well be me." The monster charged at Tom, who backed away with the torch in hand, but his steps were slow. The desperation was clear on Tom's face, as he knew his maneuver was running out of time. He tripped over a root and fell to the ground. The monster growled loudly, preparing to deliver the final blow. In the last moment, Jake, recovering from his fall, picked up a rock and threw it with all his strength at the creature, hitting it in the head. The monster turned, distracted for a second, giving Tom the opportunity to run back toward the cave. The group rushed inside, blocking the cave entrance with rocks and branches as best they could. The monster tried to reach them, but its large arms were caught. They could hear its roars of frustration outside, but for some reason, it couldn't seem to get inside. Jake, Tom, Sarah, and Lily, who was beginning to regain consciousness, huddled together in the back of the cave, exhausted but alive. For the first time since it all began, there was a glimmer of hope, however faint, that they might survive. The monster snarled outside, desperately trying to break through the improvised barrier the group had built. Each scratch against the rock made the cave tremble, but somehow the blockade held. Exhausted and injured, Jake, Tom, Sarah, and Lily, who was slowly regaining consciousness, settled at the back of the cave, breathing heavily. The silence between them was thick, filled only with the distant growls of the creature and the echo of its violent blows against the rocks. Lily slowly opened her eyes, confused and still weak, but her presence, even in such a fragile state, brought a small sense of relief to the group. "Tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse and faint. Jake moved closer, gently holding her hand. "You're safe now," he said, though fear still clung to every word. "We're going to get through this." Lily didn't respond. She closed her eyes again, but this time without panic. The simple fact that they were together gave them a small measure of comfort, despite the danger surrounding them. Jake looked over at Tom and Sarah, both exhausted but alive. They had survived so far, but they knew the danger was far from over. "We can't stay here forever," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. "It's going to find a way in, or we'll run out of water and food before that happens." Jake nodded, knowing Tom was right. They had managed to buy some time, but the creature outside seemed relentless. They were cornered with no clear plan of escape. "These symbols," Jake began, pointing to the inscriptions on the cave walls. "They talk about a sacrifice, but maybe it's not exactly what we thought. The sacrifice might not be a life, but something else. Something that calms it or convinces it we're not a threat." Sarah, still in shock from everything they had been through, tried to follow Jake's reasoning. What are you suggesting?" she asked, trying to find hope where there was almost none. Jake looked around, searching for a solution. He recalled what the monster seemed to be protecting. The forest, its territory, its land. The symbols showed respect, a balance between the creature and the ancient inhabitants. Maybe we need to show respect, not fight, but make it clear we don't want to violate this place. That we understand the forest belongs to it, Jake said, his words uncertain. But it was the only idea he could muster in their desperate situation. Tom looked at Jake skeptically, but knew they didn't have many other options. They were already in a life-or-death situation, and any plan seemed better than waiting to be hunted. "All right, but how do we do that?" Tom asked. "We can't exactly go out there and start a conversation with that thing." Jake thought for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ancient marks on the walls. Then an idea formed. "We need to use these symbols," he said, approaching the cave walls. "Let's draw them at the entrance as a way to show we accept the rules. Maybe that'll show the monster we're not a threat." With what little energy they had left, the group began tracing the ancient symbols at the cave entrance, using stones and charred fragments of what they found on the ground. The idea seemed absurd, but at that moment, it was their only hope. When they finished, they retreated from the entrance and waited. The sounds of scratching and growling continued outside, but something changed. The strikes against the cave grew softer, and the silence, once terrifying, now seemed to bring a strange sense of peace. The monster was no longer trying to break in. The group stood still, holding their breath, waiting for the creature to attack again. But the monster seemed to have backed off. Time passed slowly, and minutes turned into hours. They didn't dare leave yet, but something in their hearts told them they might have succeeded. When the first rays of morning light began to filter into the cave, Jake, Tom, Sarah, and Lily knew the worst was over. Carefully, they dismantled the barrier and stepped outside. The forest was calm, almost serene, as if the terror of the previous night had been nothing more than a nightmare. The monster was gone, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. The group began their walk back to town. The path was now clear, and they followed it in silence, aware that they had survived something no one would believe. But they knew the forest would never forget them. The marks of terror would remain, both in their minds and in the heart of those ancient trees. When they finally spotted the first houses of the small town, Tom turned to look back at the forest one last time. Maybe we shouldn't tell the whole story," he said, his voice somber. Jake, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. They had learned a harsh lesson and knew that the story of the Virginia monster would live on. But perhaps it was better if it stayed just a legend.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.